Hey everybody out in YouTube land and all my brothers in Clan TSD. Thought I'd do a quick video. First off, what I'm doing here today on this video is nothing new. Lots of guys have done it before. But I recently did an arrow mod, and some friends had a bunch of questions for me, so I figured easiest way to answer the questions is to do yet another video on the subject, and hopefully it'll help those out and even some others that have questions about this. I'm going to run really quick because I really don't want to drag you guys' time out and get too long-winded. So here is the topic of conversation. Many of us in the traditional archery instinctive discipline, we like to go out stumping, going out in the forest and shooting various odd and sundry objects, be it that log or whatever the case may be. Sometimes when you're shooting at objects, they may end up being a little harder than you anticipated them being. And as I finally learned for truth, is that even when you're shooting highly durable arrows, like I prefer the GT, the gold tip traditional arrows, even they are susceptible to damage. Now, one of the aspects of damage that they're susceptible to is when the insert, which is in the end of your arrow, when you impact too hard, that insert can get shoved inside the arrow, which will cause your carbon fibers to just splay out and basically destroy the end of your arrow. I'll try and get a focus going here. Okay, here you can see the front end of one of my GT trads that took a little bit of a hard hit on a hard spot on a stump. Just happened to be a hard spot. The other spots on this stump, we stuck arrows in it, quite a few, and had no problems, but this particular one had a hard spot on it, and as you'll see, took that insert and just shoved it back down in that arrow and just split it wide open. So that is the problem we're going to address today. So, taking an arrow, as I have mine set up right here, this is my standard setup for target arrow slash up till now stumping arrow, and realizing that there's a problem with potentially damage to the front of the arrow, decided to reinforce it. Now, let me say that the reinforcement technique that I'm using today is nothing new, nothing I came up with. Many others have done it. It's just my own slant on it. And then here we have a reinforced arrow. You'll see a much longer collar over the front, which basically what this collar or sleeve allows us to do is hold those fibers of that front of that arrow together, so that when they're trying to attempt to splay apart, we're keeping that from happening. And so we're going to put a collar on there. Okay, so realizing that we're going to take and modify an existing arrow that has already been bare shaft tested and already set up, flying the right spine and stuff, and we're going to be transitioning from this to this, we have to realize that this collar is going to add extra weight. So we have to make allowances for that. Now, as these arrows are set up for my normal shooting, I have a 50 grain brass insert in there. And so if I'm going to add more weight here, I'm either going to have to completely bare shaft, or I'm going to have to make some adjustments in weight. So what I decided to do is go from the 50 grain insert back to the stock aluminum 11.5 grain insert. So now it's time to do a little bit of math. I've already done the math out so we can save all the calculator time. But basically, if I'm dropping from a 50 grain insert down to a 11.5, Now to keep my bear shaft set up the same, if I do the simple math and do the subtraction, I come up with a need of this sleeve being 38.5 inches. Now, one of the questions that was asked was, how do I know how long to cut the sleeve to? Well, that's pretty much a very simple task, in that I took my basic scale that I used to weigh my points, arrows width, and so forth, and I had purchased a foot-long section of the tube. I then weighed the foot-long section of this tube, and I found out that the tube, 12 inches long, came out to 380 grains. Now, because I know that I'm going to need to figure out, I took the 380 grains and start dividing it down, and ultimately came out to the math that for every 1/16 of an inch, I was going to end up with 1.98 grains of sleeve. So then, doing the math of the 1.98 grains of sleeve, I determined that in terms of 1/16 of an inch, to meet this need for 38.5 inches, I needed to come out with about 19.4 times 1/16 of an inch. So if you will, 1 inch and 3.4/16. Now that would put me at exactly this weight. Now I took into account that when I'm putting the sleeve on, I'm going to be adding some glue. So what I did was I rounded down and just said, you know what, we'll go 1 and 3/16 length for this tube. And that's how I came out to the length of my tube, realizing that I wasn't going to get exact, but the important thing is I'm going to stay consistent, and I'll be within, you know, maybe half or a couple of grains with the end product, you know, in comparison to what I had here bare shafted. Okay, real quick note on cutting. I tend to cut any of my non-ferrous metals, brass, aluminum, etc., with good old-fashioned bandsaw. It's a little bit rough, but it works. Obviously, you can't cut steel and so forth, but I find this to be a very quick and efficient manner of doing that. So, having marked my tube at 1 and 3/16, using my guide here to make sure that I'm going to cut something nice and square. And there we have a rough cut. Okay, now we get to trimming this up a little bit. Now what I like to use is, for a lightweight application such as this, I like to use my drill press. Now I realize that not everybody will have a drill press, and my apologies, but this is what we use. Drill press does a wonderful job of spinning an object. So I can not only trim it and clean it up, but I can also bevel my edges on my corners on each end, so that I have a fairly smooth sleeve. So I can use a file to square it off. And I can also take my file, use my file to put a little bit of a bevel on each end. Okay, back to it. Now an important note when using a drill press like this, you're doing lightweight work, you don't need to tighten it down with a chuck. You can just hand tighten your chuck, with a chuck key, you can just hand tighten, because you don't want to crush this, and if you start tightening it with a chuck. So anyhow, long story short, to simplify things, cut, trimmed, on the one end where we sawed, deburred a little bit, and what we end up with, get this focused on for you, is end up with my sleeve here. And my sleeve, if you can see, is beveled off on the corners, deburred, and let me see if we can do this, ending up with 1 and 3/16. So that should give me right about the weight category that we calculated, plus a little glue. We should be in the general proximity of where we were with our original weight setup. Okay, so here we are, just for double check, back at our scales. You can see I'm zeroed out and I'm in the grain setting. And let's see what this comes out to. I'm seeing 37 grains, which puts us about 1.5 grains shy of where we need to be. I'm thinking we're going to get about 1.5 grains worth of glue in this mess by the time we're all done, so I'm happy with that. Okay, next step here obviously is to get the insert out. It's kind of a small detail, but I thought I'd show the way I do things in case others are having a question about that. Using hot melt glue on inserts, the trick is heat the insert. Do not heat the carbon shaft. Direct heat to this carbon shaft will destroy it. So what I want to do is just very carefully get this insert up, and I'm heating the insert and the insert only. Now this takes a little bit of patience because we don't want to overheat things again. But eventually we're going to get that insert heated up to the point where it's going to melt that hot melt glue that's inside. And use our insert tool, whatever it is we have, and pop out the old insert. Okay, now a little personal note of mine is I'm going to use hot melt glue for putting the sleeve and stuff on. Some people use JB Weld. I love JB Weld. It's a great product, but take in mind the word weld in JB Weld. If you use JB Weld and you put it on arrows, inserts, sleeves, or whatever, then you must figure that that's the last time you're ever going to use those parts, because if you get it on there right, it's going to be a huge amount of work to get it off or out of those inserts. And if you should suffer damage to the arrow somewhere mid shaft or whatever, and you want to recover those parts, they're non-recoverable if you use JB Weld. So I like to use hot melt glue even for this, because it allows me to recover those parts from damaged arrows in the future. Okay, so whenever I use hot melt glue, you end up with some kind of glue cleanup. Thing that I'm liking to do here is, if I know that my shaft or my sleeve is going to be 1 3/16, I'm going to mask off the back end of the shaft a little bit so as to help me deal with any glue runoff and clean up later. So having marked 5/16, we now have a nice little mask at 5/16. Now some people might say, oh well, that also helps you know how far to put the sleeve on. Really that's not an issue, and you'll see why, because I want the end of the sleeve to be flush with the insert here, and you'll see how I work that in just a second. Okay, so we're back here with a torch on. Now what I want to do now is get some more hot melt glue on the rest of my shaft for this sleeve, and I also want to make sure that got a good little bit on the rest of the insert too. And I tend to just heat my hot melt glue up right on the thing, and just liberally spread it on. If we have leftovers, then we'll clean it up. Hot melt glue is relatively inexpensive. Having done that now, simple task of taking my insert and heating it up. Brass is just like aluminum, it's a good conductor of heat, so spend a little time heating this up. And I should be able to just start shoving it right onto that shaft. And as you can see, it just peels off all that excess hot melt glue. And then I just take it and on a flat surface, push it down. So now it is smooth and even with the front of my shaft. Now all I've got to do is cool it off. A little pan of water. Just tip the very end in, because we don't want to get water all over the shaft. But metal parts, aluminum and brass, do just fine. And I can maybe even swirl it around, and that helps cool it off and solidify it to get it solidified. And basically we're on now. Now just a little bit of cleanup process, just with a sharp edge. I don't want to mar up the brass, so I'm not getting right up against the brass, but I'm just getting that excess hot melt glue. And it's a bit of a trouble. You start getting all this extra glue, but we are trying to build good, tough points, so getting the glue off is important to us. And having masked this off, I'm now able to essentially keep most of my glue off the shaft. You can see got a little bit of tape left where got some glue on, but it'll be easy enough to get off. Okay, now got our shaft here that's a little bit yucky looking because we've applied heat and hot melt glue to it or whatever. And so the next dilemma is cleaning it up. Now I realize again this is something the rest of y'all may not have, but I built the cresting lathe sometime back, and I found that not only does it work really nicely for cresting, but it is a lathe, so it spins my arrow, and armed with the appropriate sandpapers and so forth, I can use it to begin spinning my arrow and start cleaning up my shaft, or my sleeve here. A little bit of cleanup, some 1000 grit sandpaper, and I always like to finish things off with some 3/0 or 4/0 steel wool. And we now have a nice sleeve that is not only functional, but in my book, love the looks of brass, kind of pretty too. Okay, so at the end of the project, we've taken an arrow with a standard or a aftermarket 50 grain brass insert. Removed the 50 grain brass insert, went back to the aluminum 11.5 grain, and installed the sleeve, and came out with something that looked like this. And here we go. And whether you choose to go back to good old-fashioned field point, or Zawiki Judos, or whatever your choice is, you're now set up for stumping. Now somebody asked me about the insert. Hopefully I can get you a good focus on this, and you can see that down in there you still have the aluminum insert, but it's buried flush with the brass sleeve. So it's all now become essentially one piece. And while using the hot melt glue might not be quite as strong as say JB Weld, I think it's plenty strong enough, and it'll give me the ability to salvage these parts should I take a hit and break an arrow mid-shaft or whatever down the road. Another quick note. These sleeves are not only great for keeping the shaft from splitting, but in stumping sometimes we'll get an arrow that's really buried, and we end up using tools to try and extricate these arrows from the stumps. This particular arrow, which I'm going to do the same, I'll use as an example. If I can get the focus going here, you can see right there towards the tip where this arrow suffered a little damage. That was from getting extricated out of a stump, and a tool slipped and gouged the finish on this arrow. Now, it's not a catastrophic damage, but it is still as damage to the shaft itself. If this had had that brass sleeve on it, then the brass had got scratched. No real harm, no foul. Take it back to the shop, a little bit of a file or some 1000 grit sandpaper, and we're all clean and shiny again. So the sleeves not only help keep your arrows together, keep them tough, but they can help protect the front end of your arrow during that extrication process that we've all had to endure while stumping. All right, everybody, hope you've enjoyed that little tour of my sleeve making process. Like I said, it's not anything that I came up with. I will not claim credit for any of this. You'll find many videos out there on the subject. Chris Billingsgate does some really good videos on the subject. In fact, he's the one that inspired me to do this. So thanks, Chris, for your inspiration and continued work in this area. And hope this contributes, and maybe somebody who hasn't seen one of these yet gets additional inspiration. And feel free to, by all means, like I said, go look at Chris Billingsgate's site, and he has videos on it. Look at all the videos, find all the different techniques, different things that work for you. Chris tends to salvage old aluminum arrows to use this. I don't have aluminum arrows, so I went to the hobby shop and found the sleeve. And note on that, these arrows are the 5/16 arrows, GT trads, and I found 11/32 brass sleeve at my local hobby shop that deals in radio control airplanes, etc., and found it to be just a great little fit. So brass, aluminum, it's all your choice. That's the way I went. Thanks for joining me. Hope this helps out. Bye.